Welcome in, everyone, to the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner, and today I am super excited to have Penn Cole joining us on the show. Penn has a series, the Kindred's Curse Saga, and it is a 4-book series. If I'm not mistaken, 3 books have been published in ebook. The 4th is coming soon. But Penn has a super interesting story because she indie published the Kindred's Curse Saga, or began that, and then Atria Books, which is a division of Simon and Schuster, picked up the hardcover rights to the book. And so we've got this super interesting story where we have an indie author who found a way to straddle both worlds, and 1 foot in the indie and 1 foot in traditional publishing, and doing exactly what is best for her career. We've said it before that this is the best time to be alive for writers, because writers are in control of what happens. And they don't have to just, you know, sign away everything for a deal that may or may not be the best for them. The first book in the series is called Spark of the Everflame. It is out in ebook format now. If you want to grab the Kindle edition, you can grab that from Amazon. It's also in Kindle Unlimited if you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber. And the brand new re-release of the hardcover. This is the first time it's been in hardback. Is that right, Penn?
No, there was an indie
Okay,
hardcover. So yeah, just a
gotcha.
re-release.
Well, the re-release through Atria Books, Simon and Schuster, comes out next week, if I'm not mistaken. And guys, I would love to show you my hardcover edition of this, but my daughter-in-law was by the other day and she saw it sitting on my coffee table and she swept it off to her house. Penn, this is they put so much love and care and, shall we say, money into this hardcover edition. When I took the dust cover off of it, the embossed cover, the full color, whatever you call it, just inside the front and back cover.
Mhm.
Um, what a gorgeous, gorgeous book this is. So anyway, I've been rambling on. Welcome to the show, Penn. I'm
Thank
so
you so
glad to have
much.
you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm super happy to be here.
Well, I love to start the show with a fun question as kind of an icebreaker. And one thing that I love to ask people is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh my gosh, very young, very, very young. This is always what I have wanted to do from a very young age. I remember my mother, and she, raised me as a single mom, and she every night would lay in bed with me and read me stories. And I was very lucky that she read me books that were not inappropriate, but far above what I
Yeah.
would have been reading on my own at that age. And so it really got me into literature early on in my life, and it became something I really loved, and just a big part of my life. And when I was alone, I would make up stories and think about the books that I had read and put myself in them and imagine how I would have written them a little bit differently, and act them out. I think probably everybody does that when they're a kid,
Yeah.
but the idea of immersing myself in this fictional world, and in particular a fantasy world, was something that's been with me from truly as early as I can remember, just my entire childhood, and only got stronger as I got older.
Thank God for parents
No
who
kidding.
push us a little and stretch our imaginations to places that, but I had a similar experience with I had a mom who would introduce me to books. And, when I would be reading, well, I got passed, I have an older sister and she would pass down Nancy Drew mysteries and things like that. And I think that's where my love of mystery comes from to this day. But then mom would hand me a thick, fantasy novel. She gave me The Hobbit when I was maybe in the 2nd grade, I think, which is not
Right.
terribly inappropriate for a 2nd grader. Maybe a little. The language was far above where I was, but subject matter, it was okay. But then, she passed me The Lord of the Rings, and then, and on and on and on and on, and then, not to mention all the Star Trek novels and
Right.
stuff. But just the ever present push, to stretch when I would have been happy reading, Dick and Jane books probably, but well,
Yeah,
anyway.
exactly.
What
And when
what
when that kind of stuff becomes part of your life at a young age, I feel like
Yeah,
it cements into you in a way that it may not when you experience it as an adult or later on, but like
right.
when you're a kid, it just you absorb it and it becomes part of you.
What do you think, what ignited your passion for fantasy? Was there a particular story? Was it just the whimsical nature? What is it that because I can remember back on my time and just the thought of magic being real and the thought that society would have progressed differently if magic would have been around instead of the technology that we I don't know what it was, but that instilled a lifelong love of chasing these magical stories for me.
I can't remember anything specific that made me fall in love with fantasy. I think I just always loved it and it was just what I gravitated towards always. But I do remember that my first romantasy that I read really sort of changed the course of my life because growing up, fantasy was a very male dominated genre
Right.
and you didn't see a lot of particularly female main characters. A lot of times they were kind of ancillary or just a love interest. And I remember when I read my first romantasy, which was
Well,
Cushiel's Dart by Jacqueline Carey.
there's
Eh,
always the evil witch that's brought
yeah,
in.
right, right, but it's never the woman's story, you know?
Right,
And
right.
so when I read the first one where it was like all of these fantasy books that I had read and loved, but it was this a woman's story and her journey, and she was the one, fighting the dragons and saving the kingdom.
Yeah,
That sort of just changed my whole mindset of like, oh, this can be a place for me too. And these are stories I can tell, not just about some man who slays the dragon, but the woman who does it.
right.
And that I think reading that book is when I knew this is something I wanted to do with my life.
Y Romantasy, if we can use that term, I think that's
Yeah.
that is a solidified term at this point, has really had a moment these last 5 years, 10 years, maybe. I'm trying to think of when this groundswell really started. Um, but what do you is it because, um, uh, people, women specifically, are feeling like they are finally represented in fantasy? Is that kind of what the allure, the draw, I mean, Romantasy is
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say one of the probably the hottest selling, segment of fantasy right now.
Yeah.
Is it because there's been this 50% of the population that's been underserved all this time?
I think that's a huge part of it. I mean, I think it was kind of a perfect storm of a lot of different factors. Romantasy has been around for decades, which
Sure.
I think some people think it's a newer genre, and it really isn't. I mean, we
Right.
have some incredible authors that have been writing it for decades and decades, but it certainly has just exploded
Yeah.
over the
It
last years. And I think some of that is, fantasy just generally has really been on a rise. Like with the rise of Game of Thrones being on TV and its success, I think that's gotten more people back into reading fantasy books. I think COVID had a big part of it. People were at home
Yeah.
more, they had more time to read and a lot more downtime. And I think that I've talked to so many people who that reintroduced them to their love of reading that they had sort of gotten away from since their college years. And then yeah, I think particularly with the publication of ACOTAR, A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, and how popular it became on TikTok, that was kind of the gateway drug into
Yeah.
romantasy for a lot of people, where it showed them like, oh, I can read these amazing, epic fantasy stories that center women and their journeys. It doesn't always just have to be about a band of men,
Right.
traipsing around saving the world.
Yeah. Do you discover, a lot of men that connect with your books? Yeah, I don't know this, I've not had a lot of conversations about this, but I would assume that men, would probably think that it's more romance than it is fantasy, and, kind of, but that maybe not for me, but how would you answer that? And just because you add romance to a book, does that automatically negate the epic fantasy portions of the story?
The irony is that we sort of have a perception of fantasy as being, okay, there's fantasy and then there's romantasy, and they're
Right.
different things. And in some ways they are. But if you look at, certain popular romantasy books,
Mhm.
the romance content is not any different than you would get in Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or any of these books that we think of as, epic fantasy staples. It's, I think, because it is caters more to women, it just, there's the perception that is more important or plays a bigger role. I don't know that necessarily bears out in the stories themselves. Sometimes
Yeah.
it does, but not always. I think it really is more of a perception than reality thing. But yeah, I've had lots of male readers who have enjoyed the series. My husband, I got him into reading Romantasy, and he loves it. He's as big a fan of a lot of these series that I am. I've seen on TikTok, there's a lot of like guys reading clubs, and they're reading. I think they kind of started it as like a way to read books that girls liked to connect with them, but they're finding that they really love these stories too, and that they're really identifying with the male characters in them, and finding sort of a different side of a male character than they might find in traditional
Yeah.
fantasy as well. So yeah.
Well, if you're a man and you have a wife or you have a girlfriend or you hope to get one of those, you could do a lot worse than read things that you think they would like.
Honestly.
You know, there's a lot worse things you could do. Um, you mentioned that romantasy has really been around for a while, and it's just kind of getting, it's kind of becoming part of the zeitgeist, if you will. This really since COVID, I think is I think you nailed it there. But you mentioned Game of Thrones. George R. R. Martin was putting in these storylines. What he published that first book in the late '80s, early '90s, whatever it was. I think '80,
Yeah.
90, if I remember right. I could have that wrong. But and he talked about the people would give him grief about some of the more explicit scenes, and he said, "Well, you would describe a sword battle in very explicit terms," and he said, "I'm just describing this other side of life." And while
Yeah.
let's not pretend that Game of Thrones is necessarily a romantasy, but there are parts of it that at least he's showing the wide spectrum of human emotion. I think it's safe to say that. And I've told writers forever, whether you're writing a thriller or a fantasy, it would do you good to read some romance and to figure out how to describe interpersonal relationships. There's a
Right.
lot of fantasy that could really stand to have some believable relationships. We could do a lot worse than that. How are you seeing publishing respond to this reader response to romantasy and to fantasy stories with more representation, and do you see that echoing in the publishing industry? I mean, you have a great publishing story yourself, so obviously you have, but what do you see in the because publishing is kind of this giant ship that's very slow to turn sometimes, but what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, romantasy is definitely the hot thing right now that publishers are snapping up left and right. And what's been really interesting to see is how aware they are of indie romantasy, and
Yeah.
how much indie authors are doing in the genre, and in some ways trying to replicate that in to varying degrees of success, but
Yeah.
also, reaching out to those authors and snapping them up and buying, the print rights, or in some cases the full rights, and, hopping on that ship that has already started sailing. So I'm very impressed with how publishing is embracing the genre. And I think a lot of them are opening now romantasy imprints that really focus on that too, which is incredible. So I love to see that. I love to see that fantasy sections in bookstores are starting to become a lot more, you're seeing more parity, where you have books that really cater to not just men, but men and women. and I think it's great. I think we're in the early days. As you said, publishing is slow to move. And I think we're really only just now starting to see kind of the first big wave of romantasy books that are starting to come out after they really started to leap on the genre aggressively. So the next year or two, I think, will be really telling in terms of how that's going, whether they're, doing it successfully. We'll see.
Yeah. I want to stick a pin in this publishing talk for just a second, and we'll come back to that. But you are originally from Dallas, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Dallas, Texas.
But you do not live in Dallas right now.
No, I live in Paris, France.
Paris, France, of
Yeah.
course, from Dallas to Paris. Why
Slightly
not?
different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why does that not make sense? What's your story of winding up in Paris?
Well, my husband and I lived here for a few years earlier on in our life, right after we got married, just as kind of I don't know, just like an adventure to have for a few years. But then during COVID, we moved back because of my husband's job. And then during COVID, I think as many people did, we sort of weren't super happy with our lives. We were kind of just working all of the time. I was an attorney at the time. He works in tech. So we were both working just 100-hour weeks, and said, this is not the life that we want for ourselves. And so we kind of stepped back and said, well, what life do we want? What can we do? And so I had always wanted to be an author, but for various reasons, I kept putting it off. And my husband wasn't super happy in the job that he had. So he said, you know what? Let's do it. So he found a job here in France that would sponsor our visa. And I left my job as an attorney and decided to pursue publishing my first novel. And yeah, we just moved to France for an adventure, I guess.
That's so wild. I mean, good for you. That's what, and why not? Why, especially in the connected world that we live in now? You
Yeah,
really, the barriers are not uh, as as uh, as much of an overcomable obstacle as as it
exactly.
used to be. Yeah.
Exactly.
So so you had this idea for the first novel before you moved,
Um,
or were you just had the idea that you wanted to write a novel?
Yeah, it was
Okay.
more of that. I mean, I had lots
Yeah.
of different ideas of
Oh, yeah.
stories that I wanted to write. I don't know that this particular one had really taken root quite yet, but I knew that I wanted to write romantasy. I've always wanted to write it, and I could see that it was getting popular. And I thought, okay,
Right.
now is the time to strike. So I just kind of said before I really even started writing, I actually took several months to just study the industry and just join a bunch of indie author forums and read a ton of really popular books in the genre and say, like, okay, I want this to be successful. So what does successful look like? And
Right.
studied the genre before I started writing my first book, which I think is a little reverse to how it often happens, where people just need to write something and they get it out and then they learn the craft or the industry a little bit later.
Yeah, that what you described, if I think, is most people's story is I've got this book, and now what do I do with it? And then they,
Right.
but that was brilliant that you realized there was an industry, there was a way to do this. Let's pump the brakes a minute, figure out kind of what the lay of the land is, and then I'm assuming that you, by doing the reading and seeing what was popular at the time and what connected with you, you were doing some market research to find out, when I write this book, let's make sure there's going to be an audience for this book, instead of retelling our high school angst, which is what most people do in their first book, I think,
Right, right.
and then figure out who wants to read this, and like most people, it winds up in a desk drawer, and then we write the book that we should be writing. Did When gathering all of that information, did that help you to tell the story that you wanted? How quickly did a plan come together?
Um, well, I So the actual book itself, I mean, I think I plotted the entire series in maybe a day or two. It tends to when the faucet turns on, it
Yeah.
floods out, and then
Yeah.
I tend to work very quickly in that regard. But I just spent so much time planning before I ever really got to that stage, so that when I
Yeah.
was ready to say, okay, I know kind of what needs to go in a book. Well, I
Mhm.
think I know it needs to go in a book to make it successful. Now, what do I want the book to be about? And that's always how I've been. I'm very analytical, and I like to sort of do a lot of research before I make any decision.
Yeah.
So it was a little quick and a little slow at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I love to explore is how different pursuits in life add tools to our toolbox. I've interviewed over 1,700 authors over the last decade, and I can name probably on one hand the number of authors um, who had a sole goal of becoming a published author, and that's the only thing they ever pursued. Went to college, got an MFA,
Right.
started pursuing publishing, and that was their only thing. Most the extreme vast majority, kind of
Yeah.
took a circuitous route, and they got over here and they collected some experience, and they met people over here, all of those little things are building the story in your mind, and working different jobs and things add different tools to your toolbox that you can then refer back to. You mentioned earlier that you worked as an attorney, and you think of the very analytical work of being an attorney versus the very creative work of being an author, and we know that those lines blur on both sides of those, obviously. But did your time as an attorney, your studying for the bar exam and all of that, does any of that play into your life as a creative writer now? Are there tools that live in your toolbox now that you can look back on and say, "Oh, I'm so thankful that I got this training, that I got this experience, that I met these people, that I moved to Paris, that, whatever those life experiences are, did they add things to your author toolbox that you pull back on today?"
The attorney to author pipeline is so real. There's so many
Yeah,
of us. It's
so many, so
crazy.
many.
So
Yeah.
there's gotta be something there.
The
I mean,
yeah. There's
they're
maybe it's
really
writing briefs or,
I
the
don't know.
the hours of research. I don't know what it is, but there are so many. Yeah.
Well, essentially, our work as attorneys is thinking up all the terrible things that could happen, and how
Right.
do we either prevent them, or how do we solve them if they do happen? And that's a lot. That's a lot like being an author, right? We put our
Yeah.
characters in situations, and we think, what's all the terrible things that could happen to our characters, and then we make them happen, and then we
Yeah.
have to find ways for our characters to get out of them. So I do think there's a lot of overlap there. But before I was an attorney, I was actually a wedding photographer. I've had
Okay.
many different careers. I've had a very circuitous route, but I think that really helped me a lot, because in that industry, like in this one, I was an artist, and I did create art, and that was at the core of my business.
Mhm.
But I also had to be a business person, and I
Right.
had to think about marketing and customer service and legal and finance, and all of that other stuff. And I saw how difficult that can be for people who are real creatives and really artist minded, to also embrace the business side of creating that art. That it can be a real struggle for people. And so having that experience, I think, of balancing both the art and the business, and developing my skill set on both sides, I think really prepared me well for becoming an author, especially an indie author, because when you're an indie author, you're basically a publisher also. And so
Right.
craft is super important. You have to write a very good book, but you also have to be able to do all of that other stuff too.
Yeah.
So I think that was critical in setting me up for success as an author.
Gotcha. You said that you originally planned out this whole series. I think a lot of people, especially with a fantasy book, they have a great idea, they finish it, and then a publisher says, "Well, what comes next, or they indie publish and readers are like, okay, I want the next chapter, and you're like, I wonder what can happen now. Did thinking of this saga uh in a complete arc, did that help you to start realizing this, and so that you didn't bump up into problems like that about, what do I do next? Like, how did you start thinking? Did you know that series potential was going to be a thing before you got started?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Romantasy, there are some standalones, but it's pretty rare. Pretty much
Yeah.
everything is a usually 3 or more book series, and I think readers really love that. They love bingeability and falling into a world and staying there for a long time. So I knew that was something I wanted to do. And also, when I was doing my sort of market research, one of the things I asked myself is, okay, well, what books or series stand out to me the most? And what were the ones that I couldn't stop thinking of when I finished reading them, and why? And a big thing that came up over and over again was I loved the books where I could reread the series and see all of the foreshadowing and all of the clues that they laid out, and see how in chapter 1 of book 1 they previewed how the entire series would end, because they
Right.
knew, that early. And I absolutely love when authors are able to do that and lay those little Easter eggs throughout. So I knew that was what I wanted to do with my series. And maybe some other authors are really good at doing that as a pantser and tying that stuff together. I'm not. That is not a skill set I have. So I knew I had to plan every book really far in advance so that I would be able to lay those foundations in each book. And it was that's something I hear a lot from readers, that they really love and made this series special for them. So I think that was a good choice on my part.
Yeah. As a hardcore planner, and I think it's probably safe to call you a hardcore planner if you laid
Mhm.
out 4 books before, writing the first one. Do you find yourself, with characters or storylines that want to venture
Oh
into
yeah.
other areas as
Oh
you're
yeah.
writing? Like,
Oh yeah.
and you do, I think it's safe, as you just alluded to, but how do you handle the desire to go in different direction, um, or the freedom to let a story grow past what you originally imagined? Like, how do you handle the wanting to pants a little bit in the writing while staying true to your, overarching plan that you have?
Personally, I love plotting everything out in as much detail as I can, but I also let go of it once I start to write. It's there if I need it, but I don't hold myself to my outline at all if things start to veer off. I let them go where they're going to go, and sometimes that means I need to re-outline a book or make some adjustments. I found that for the most part, my outline gives me guardrails to stay within. And so while things deviate, the overall story hasn't really changed that much. It's more about sort of wiggling in the middle and extra little plot arcs, or really more adding nuance and adding depth to the original story that I plan, as opposed to changing it entirely. There have definitely been some very big changes. I actually, when I first plotted out my book, my outline started in what is now book 2. And so book 1 was a complete like ladder addition to the outline that
Yeah.
I never originally foresaw. But as I started writing, I think I got like 75,000 words in and realized, like, no, I need to write a book before this. We need a lot more story here. So, you just have to let the characters in the story take you where they're going to go. And I think not be so beholden to your outline that it suffocates your creativity.
Yeah. You were living in Paris, and you had dedicated yourself to writing this book, or this series. Where did you have a daily regimen where, did you kind of treat this as your full-time job, or how did you how did you handle the writing of the first book?
So I had planned to get a legal job here and write kind of nights and weekends. And I just couldn't find a job, to be honest with you. I sort of stumbled into being a full-time author because I couldn't get a job. So blessing and a curse a little bit.
Yeah.
Thankfully, my husband was working, so we were okay financially.
Yeah.
But I never really intended to become a full-time author quite so early in my career. Thankfully, it worked out okay. And so once I after a few months of applying for jobs and not really getting any interest, my husband said, "Listen, why don't you just go all in on the writing thing? Like, it's what you want to be doing. You seem happier when you're working on that. Give it a year. And if in a year you don't want to do it anymore or whatever, you can always go back to, being an attorney. But take 1 year and do it and see what happens." So I did. And I essentially hyperfixated. I just wrote 24/7 around the clock, every waking moment. I was, having so much fun. I was just loving every second of it. So it was, yeah, I mean, it was basically 24/7. If I was awake, I was working on something. I was either researching or, lurking in indie author forums and reading everything I could or writing as much as I could. And that year I was just consumed with it.
Yeah. How long did it take you to get through that first draft of the first book?
That one came pretty quickly. I think I drafted after I kind of had to start over to draft book 1. I think I knocked it out in maybe 6 weeks or less. I can't remember exactly, but around a month, I think a little over
Yeah.
a month. And then I immediately went into book 2. And I think it took me about 3 months to write book 2. And then I immediately went into book 3. And it took me about 8 months to write book 3. So it was really about just a year solid of writing the first 3 books all in a row. And I wrote all 3 books before I ever published the first one. So when I finished book 1, I kind of just set it aside and didn't really look at it for a year.
I love it. How many words were in book 1 roughly in that first draft, I
Book
guess?
1 was about 105,000.
Okay. I say that because today is October 1st, and we're kicking off a writing challenge. We call it our 60-day novel challenge. And we all know that November is National Novel Writing Month, where, NaNoWriMo for 25 years has challenged people to write 50,000 word novel in the month of November, which comes out to 1,667 words a day for 30 days. And it seems like such a daunting task, if you've never done it before. And then you start breaking it down, you're like, well, 1,600 words. If I can do a couple of writing sprints during the day, I can get 6, 7, 800 words in a 20-minute writing sprint. I can do that. If I sit down a couple of times a day, I can do that. You in a month to 6 weeks, you wrote 100,000. That's anybody can if you can do that, and I know you're hyper fixating on it, but
Yeah.
it's doable is my point, especially if you take time ahead of time to plan it out, know what you're doing each day. When you sit down, you know what's got to be done, you know what scenes got to be written, you've got to move this character from here to here. It having a plan obviously helped you greatly.
Yeah, I will say that, I had a lot of privilege in that I didn't have kids to take care of. I didn't
Right.
have a job at the time making demands on my time.
Right.
And so I don't know, I couldn't do that. Oh, hold on, sorry. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I had a lot of, I was very lucky to have all that
Yeah.
time. I could not do that now. There's no way I could keep up that same pace now. And I definitely don't want anybody to look at that pace and think, if I can't do that, I'm behind or I'm too slow. Right. So there are many days where I'm lucky if I can get 100, 200 words out, because there's just other things in my life going on now. But I do think sitting down every single day and writing a little bit every single day, even if it is only 50, 100 words, just committing to taking a little bit of time every day and putting your brain in the mindset of being creative. It's a muscle, and like any muscle, it gets stronger the more you flex it and the more regularly you use it.
Right.
So I would just really encourage people to not make it necessarily about word count or how many words they get done in a day, but just being regular with it and setting aside some time, even if it is only 15, 20 minutes that you can do it.
Right. So you wrote the first 3 books before you ever published the first word. You did I'm assuming you had a plan, you understood, something about publishing, and you knew that you needed to, I'm assuming, do a sort of rapid release, of like, what was your plan? How did you start piecing together your marketing for the, when you first published, and no one knew to expect a trilogy out of you?
Yeah, so as I was studying the genre and studying, what other authors did and what readers like, I could see that bingeability was a big factor
Right.
in this genre, and also just it's so hard as an indie author to get people to take a chance on you when you have only 1 book out or only 2 books out. People really want to wait until you have either a completed series or a few series out, before they really want to take a chance on you. And so I knew that I wanted to come into the market really quickly and get as many books, or at least some books, on the market as quickly as I could, to just encourage readers to take a chance on me, but also to make all of the marketing efforts that I invested pay off a bit sooner, because you can market a single book for a year and that it's a tough sell,
Yeah.
in any genre, it's a tough sell.
Sure.
It's the more books you have out, the easier it is to convince people. So it was really just kind of about being strategic with saying I'd rather promote 3 books than promote 1. So, let me pre-write them and then dump them on the market as quickly as I can, and then focus on marketing the series as, oh, look, you can binge 3 long books.
Yeah.
And I think that paid off. I think that's a big part of why my series got traction pretty quickly, is because people didn't have to wait very long to get the next book, and to get to that point where they could really immerse themselves in the world.
Yeah. Indie publishing has opened a lot of doors for a lot of people, and has, removed a lot of the gatekeepers, and, all of the terms that we can use to
Yeah.
describe how um, indie publishing has really leveled the playing field in a lot of ways for people. But with that becomes a big influx of people that now, the playing field has been leveled, and more people have access, which means more books are on, Amazon, and means that, the pool of available books has gone way up.
Yeah.
How do you cut through all of that and make your book stand out?
There's a few ways, I think. A lot of it is that really doing your research in advance and really studying the market, studying things, and studying them at a very deep level. I think when we talk about writing to market, a lot of people look at it in too superficial a way.
Mhm.
They'll say, oh, well, what's hot right now? Is it vampires or is it fae? Is it, billionaire romance or is it mafia romance? And I just
Right.
don't think that's what writing to market really is. Um, if you look at what has blown up in Romantasy, no 2 of the books were the same on the surface. Like, one was vampires and one was pirates, one was Greek gods, and mine is, I don't even know how to describe what mine is. It's none of those things. And we've got fae. There's all of them are very different, and I don't think that readers necessarily say, oh, I only want to read vampires right now, or I only want to read X right now. I think readers want to read a book that they just love and that they can't stop thinking about, and they don't necessarily care about some of those superficial things. And also, when we talk about, like, I know trope marketing is a big
Mhm.
topic of discussion. And yeah, people do look for, like, enemies to lovers books, whatever, but everybody's writing enemies to lovers. It doesn't, some of those books do well, some of those don't. So it's really not about that kind of shallow stuff. I think it's a much deeper question of what is it of those thousands of books that were published, you know, in that month that made this series rise to the top, that made readers close the book and say, I need to tell other people about this. Like, I need to get everybody I know reading this so that we can talk about it, because it was so, so good. That is the stuff you have to figure out, that secret sauce. And that, you know, that's true in every genre. Of course, the answer is going to be different depending on the genre, but I think no matter what you're writing, that's what you have to do, is ask yourself, like, what is it that makes, on two books that look the same on the surface, that have similar plots, similar, you know, archetypes, tropes, whatever, what is it that makes this one so good and so memorable to readers? And if that were an easy question to answer, we'd all be, you know, New York Times bestsellers. It's definitely easier said than done. But if you can unlock that, then I think it's going to be a lot easier for you to churn out good book after good book after good book, because that kind of stuff is evergreen. You know, it's readers love that stuff forever, and you can change all of the little details, but have these core aspects be the same, and people will just eat it up over and over.
Yeah. So you published the trilogy, the first three of the 4-book series, and you sold a couple of copies. I think
A few,
half
yeah.
a million or so. You know,
Yeah.
when did this catch the attention of traditional publishing? And yeah, the first author that I remember hearing about who was able to negotiate a deal like you did was Hugh Howey with the Silo series, which is now a series on Amazon, I mean, on Apple Plus TV. You know, with Wool, and he sold the print rights and maintained his ebook rights because he you know had developed a huge following with his Kindle publishing, and was one of the early pioneers. And I remember when he negotiated that deal, everybody was like, well, that's the perfect storm of you maintain your rights for ebooks and where you've developed this readership, and then the traditional folks help you get placed in bookstores. And you know, that's the perfect scenario for a lot of people. When did your series start catching the eye of traditional publishing, and how did that all go down?
Well, it kind of was a slow ramp up. So the first people to approach were my audiobook publishers, Podium Audio,
Yeah.
and I sold my audio rights to them very, very early on. Podium is incredible about hopping on indie
Yeah,
talent, like
they
very
really are.
early. They
Yeah.
they identify, you know, what's going to be the next big thing very early on. And so I sold my audio rights to them, I think like a week or two after the second book came out, very
Oh,
quickly.
wow. Yeah,
And
they really had their
then
finger on the pulse, didn't they?
yeah, they did. And then I started to get interest from foreign publishers. And that's when I said, okay, this might have legs.
Yeah.
So I talked to a few author friends, and they really encouraged me to get an agent. And so I got my agent in, I think, October, which I first published in June. So that was, I think,
Oh, wow.
right after my third book came out is when I got
Okay.
my agent. And I, you know, I'm very lucky to have an agent who works primarily with indies
Okay.
and has done many, many deals similar to this before she worked with me. And so she really understands the indie landscape and how it,
Mhm.
you know, integrates with trad, and particularly in romantasy. And, you know, that's a very unique situation, I think. And she was able to guide me on what rights I wanted to sell and what my ideal deal looked like. And I told her from the beginning, I don't want to sell my ebook rights. I was open to it. I was open to having the conversation, but for me, I just could not imagine a number that would be worth my ebook rights that a publisher would be willing to pay. You know,
Right.
there was,
Yeah.
the gulf of those two things was too far apart, because I don't know that traditional publishers understand how much money indie authors are making on ebook right now. It's astronomical. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't even begin to count the number of six-figure authors and even 7-figure authors, I know, just on ebook alone, in some cases just on Kindle Unlimited alone. It's the door is wide open for indie authors to be just making so much money on ebook. And for me, as an indie author, print was a minuscule part of my deal. I wasn't in any bookstore, so it was really just the handful of copies that I was selling, on Amazon or, online retailers. So for me, I felt really confident in my ability to sell my ebook on my own, and not really seeing how a publisher could help me grow that side of my business. But print for sure was an area where I said, there's so much potential here. There are so many more readers I can get to if I can just get this book in bookstores. And that was the real value proposition for me. And it was not easy. There's a lot of publishers that want no part of a print only deal, for sure. And I feel very grateful for Atria, who's very forward thinking in print. They have been ahead of the trend on so many things. I mean, they were investing in Colleen Hoover early on and saw her potential and her growth, and Hannah Grace with Icebreaker over in sports romance. And so they get it. They really get it. And they are doing deals that are unique and that are cutting edge that other traditional publishers refuse to do, or maybe are only just now starting to be open to doing. So it's definitely a huge advantage to be working with a team that is so forward thinking, and that's a very rare thing in trad publishing.
So Spark of the Everflame comes out in hardback in bookstores everywhere next Tuesday,
October 8th. Yes,
October 8th. From where we're sitting right now is a week from what is
today?
Yeah, but a week from today. Yeah.
I
forget what day of the week it is. Where do we sit now? The book is about to come out. I think the first 3 books in the series are available on Kindle right now. We're going to be publishing the hardback. When is book 4 coming out, and what's on the horizon, coming next?
Oh my gosh, there's so much going on right now. So much. So on the print side of my series, book 1 is coming out next Tuesday. Book 2 is coming out in December, which again, it's incredible. I think Atria got this book to market in under 3 months, which for trad publishing is just unheard of. It's unbelievable. And to be able to do everything that they did with the book, as you mentioned, there's a lot of special features in it. And
it's gorgeous. I can't say that enough. It is you can tell a lot of care and love and time went into the presentation of it. It's an absolutely gorgeous book.
Yeah, they did a fantastic job. I could not be happier with it. So we're getting the first 2 books out. Book 3, hopefully early next year. We're still working out the details of that. Book 4 is TBD. That's a whole nother conversation. One of the hard lessons I had to learn as an author, especially an indie author, is that the amount of time you have to write changes dramatically once you publish that first book.
Oh, yes.
And in particular, if the book does well, the time you have to write becomes minuscule. So I'm still working on that and when that will come out, but soon, hopefully. I've written almost all of it, so it's just working out the kinks right now.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we talk a lot on the show about the gift of anonymity, that when you're writing those first, like that first trilogy, or for a lot of folks, that first book, and no one knows to expect anything from you because you've not published anything. You've not made a name for yourself. You've not built reader expectation yet. It's just you and the story. And it can feel so frustrating that this is going to be great. That people are going to connect with the story. The characters are everything that you want them to be, and people are going to love it. And you just can't wait to get it out into the world and for people to start making those connections with those characters and the stories and the settings of the books and all of that. Yet from your perspective, looking back, you just don't know to appreciate that time that you have to get all of those things worked out, and that you're not dealing with reader expectations. You're not dealing with, hey, Penn, when's book 4 coming out? When, you don't
Yeah,
have to deal with any of that. And, could you speak just for a second to people that are maybe in that position of wanting to rush that book out and to get to the point, and they just don't understand the blessing they have of anonymity yet?
absolutely. There's such a value, I think, in having a first series that nobody reads, honestly, because or at least at first, because
Yeah,
it gives you some freedom to just try things
yeah,
and to experiment with, different techniques and take risks, make mistakes, and just have a bad first series. And that's okay. And not necessarily have to worry about the lasting impacts of that. The having a debut series that became successful is definitely a blessing and a curse. I'm very grateful for it, but there were so many times in the process where I said, well, nobody's going to read this book. So like, it doesn't really matter. I don't necessarily need to fix that or whatever. Like I'll get
mhm,
better at this skill in my next series, thinking nobody would ever read anything I wrote until like my second or third series, right? Joke's on me. They're definitely reading it now. And so I wish so badly that I could go back and say, take a little bit more time with this, like take your time and really feel good about it. Don't necessarily rush. I see this a lot where people are rushing to get a book to market super quickly, and I
yeah,
think that's such a terrible idea. I think there's so much value in taking your time and setting a book aside. Don't publish it just because it's finished and ready to publish, right? Set it aside and work on the next book, and write your next book, and then go back to that first one and say, are there things I want to change? Are there we get better with every book that we write, right? So like, how can you improve that first book that you wrote with the benefit of the knowledge you gained through books 2 and 3? When I look at what readers love in my first book, it is always the things I added at the last second after I had written books 2 and 3, right before I published, and I kind of did a reread of book 1 again and tweaked some things. All of that stuff I tweaked is the stuff that readers obsess over, and it's their favorite part of the book. And that shows me how valuable that experience was of the next few books that I wrote, and how it allowed me to become a better author. So, it's true that you do learn a lot from each book that you publish, and there's
mhm,
value, having a book on the market as well. But I just think I wish people took a little bit more time and didn't try and rush those books out so quickly. Um, because there's so much to be learned by just letting it marinate a little
yeah.
bit, and sitting on it and letting your subconscious mind think about that story and those characters, and develop it, and let your ideas get even better and better.
Right. Well said. Spark of the Everflame, book 1 in the Kindred's Curse saga comes out in hardcover next Tuesday, October the 8th. It is available now in Kindle Unlimited, in Kindle edition. You can go grab the ebook today, start reading it, and then next Tuesday go pick up the hardcover so you can have that bookshelf brag, and show off all your friends. This is um, the perfect storm of readability. You can grab Kindle Unlimited, lay in bed with your Kindle with the front light, and then have that bookshelf trophy also. And it's no extra cost if you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber. Just go grab it. And so the first 3 books are available in Kindle Unlimited now. Then the 3 hardcovers are well, the first 2 are I think this one comes out next week, and then in December for book 2. Is that right?
Yeah, December 3rd for book 2.
Okay. And then we hope after the first of the year, book 3, when
Yeah,
you work that
soon,
stuff out. Yeah.
soon. Spring, I think.
So spring. Penn, this has been so much fun chatting. If folks are just discovering you and want to dig into all the stuff that you're up to, follow along for news and all that, is there a central place that's a good hub for folks to follow along for Penn Cold News?
Yeah, for those who are active on social media, I'm at author Penn Cole on all of the platforms. Instagram is where I, really put my focus. So that's probably the best place to follow me, but also my website, www.penncole.com. We try and keep that as updated as we can with news and appearances and all of that. And for those who enjoy the series and want to, be the first to find out when book 4 is releasing, or get bonus chapters, exclusive art, all of that stuff, I have a newsletter that I send out once a month that has all kinds of fun extra goodies as well. And you can sign up for that on my website.
Excellent. And thank you, Penn, for taking time to come on the show. We're going to link up all the pertinent links in the show notes. Go visit your local bookstore next week when the book is released. If you don't have a great local bookstore, we'll put an Amazon link where you can grab it from there. Penn, this has been so much fun chatting. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.